Okay, shall I get started?
Thanks, Leilani. That would be great.
Okay, hopefully my presenters are on, but welcome everyone to the second session of Block B, the Regional Discovery Network session. And I just wanted to sort of frame this session by saying that it was born out of a desire from some folks here in Hawaii to understand how we could boost the reach of our finding aids beyond our own institutional walls, especially given our isolated physical location. So that specific context notwithstanding, I do believe it's a topic that could be of interest to anyone who wishes to get information about their collections out to a wider audience. And so I'm truly delighted to have Mark Custer from Yale University and Amanda Focke from Rice University here to speak. Mark's going to talk about exporting EAD from ArchiveSpace to ArchiveGrid, OCLC's aggregations of descriptions of archival materials, and Amanda will speak about Texas Archival Resources Online, or Taro, a statewide consortium for displaying archival finding aids online. So as a reminder, please use the chat to answer questions. We will be holding them to the end. Let Mark and Amanda go through their presentations first. And with that, I will move the program over to them. And it looks like they are indeed online, so.
Yes, Leilani, this is Mark. Am I up first?
Yes.
Okay, great. I will share my desktop. I think that's my only option right now. Hopefully folks are seeing some stuff.
Yep, we're seeing your PowerPoint.
Awesome, great. All right, so hi everybody. My name is Mark Custer, and I will be talking about an export service that Hudson Malonglo developed for Yale University, which we have been using in production for just over a year now. I should also say that even though I'm on the panel for regional discovery networks, this talk is really a talk about synchronization. So in this talk, I won't be focusing on a specific regional network, but instead I will be discussing the process that we're using at Yale to provide up-to-date access to anyone who wants to check out our EAD files. Right now, we have a few different harvesters who check out our finding aids. The American Institute of Physics harvests a subset of our finding aids, for instance. We also submit all of our finding aids to Connecticut Archives Online, which is a service provided by Western Connecticut State University that provides access to finding aids from over 40 different institutions across Connecticut. The National Library of Medicine also harvests every finding aid from Yale's Medical Historical Library, as well as a few other finding aids at Yale related to the history of medicine. And we contribute all of our EAD finding aids to OCLC's ArchiveGrid, which is the largest EAD aggregator in the United States. Last, I should say that in some ways, Yale could also be considered consumers of our own data. Now, as for the options that we had available to provide access to our EAD files, here are a few of the ways that you can do that if you're using ArchiveSpace. You can log into the staff interface, of course, and export an EAD file. You can utilize the ArchiveSpace API to do the same. And starting with version 2.1, I believe, ArchiveSpace is packaged with an OAI PMH service that you can use to share your metadata. And there's the ArchiveSpace export service, which is the option that I will be discussing in more detail since it's how we're now providing open access to Yale's EAD. Before I do that, though, I'll provide a brief overview of how we used to provide access to our EAD files. Previously, we did not use OAI PMH or anything else fancy to share our files. What we did was export and upload our files on a weekly basis to our local discovery service, which was known as YFAD, or the Yale Finding Aid Database. Uploading to YFAD created a copy of an XML file in our online repository. We then periodically copied our files manually to another directory, which was named ArchiveGrid. And this was just a single directory of XML files, like you see on the right-hand side of the screen. Last, each repository also kept local backups of their EAD files. Because of this, we generally always had 3 versions of every EAD, one in YFAD, one in the ArchiveGrid directory, and another backup that was managed by the holding institution. So that was problematic for a lot of ways, but in all honesty, that didn't generally cause too many problems, but things definitely did get out of sync. So I'm not going to talk about how we're providing access now, which as I've already mentioned, we're using that ArchiveSpace export service, which I'll go into a little bit more detail in a second. But essentially what that does is it provides us a configurable publication pipeline, which is really intended to be a set it and forget it service. And in fact, once we set it up about a year ago, we don't ever really need to change it unless we need to add a new repository to start being exported their files as well. And there's, of course, a number of other kind of bells and whistles that we've added to it along the way, which I'll discuss in a little bit more detail. But before I do that, I just want to give a brief overview about how the service works. This is not something that's packaged with ArchiveSpace. At the end of this presentation, I'll give you the link of where you can go and get it if you're interested. But it is a separate, essentially a separate piece of code that you would have to actually download and install. So the service itself is really divided into two parts. The first part is just, it's basically a general ArchiveSpace plugin that just adds a new endpoint to ArchiveSpace. The second part is the actual export service, and it's in the directory that you'll see if you download the code. That's called exporter app. This exporter app code can live, can be co-located with the plugin and live in your ArchiveSpace server, or it could also live somewhere else. So while we were testing the development of this, for instance, I always had the exporter app just living on my local laptop. But now that we're using it in production, we have the exporter app on a local virtual machine here at Yale University, whereas our version of ArchiveSpace is actually hosted at Lyrasis. So Lyrasis hosts our version of this, the plugin endpoint. And what the export service does, it has a number of configuration options, and basically they're divided up into different job types. And we have a job that is basically just set to run every night, and for every repository it has a certain window of time that is allowed to export EAD finding aids from ArchiveSpace. And so when it's time to get to work, what it'll do is it'll just send a message to that ArchiveSpace endpoint, and it'll get a response back, and that response back will include basically, two sets of data. One will be a set of all the files that it should add, and another will be a set of all the files that it should be deleted since the last time it basically had asked. So this is why we run it nightly, and then it doesn't have to do very many updates each night because there's not that many changes each day. The removes list is pretty simple, so I won't go into real detail about it, but essentially anything that's been deleted, suppressed, or unpublished within a resource record gets added to that removes list. What happens with things get added to the adds list is a little bit more complicated, so I will break that down here on this slide and discuss what happens when any file that's going to be exported is sent through the service. So the very first step that happens, this is an optional step, and it's one that I imagine maybe it wouldn't be too particular to a lot of other institutions, but we have a policy of always creating handles for any new published finding aids. So this is basically a service that allows us to have a permanent URL to our finding aid that we don't actually have to manage locally. Well, we kind of manage it locally, but it's also managed elsewhere via this handle server. So this very first step, again, it's optional, but if it is turned on, then a handle link will be created. And at the same time, when the handle link is created, it writes back that handle to ArchiveSpace so that the archivist doesn't have to actually do anything with that. The next step is probably the one you would think of be the first step, but it's when the file actually gets downloaded as an EAD file. And the third step that happens, again, this one's not optional either, but there's a little bit of cleaning that goes on that the exporter app just handles on its own. And this is really just there to take care of some tricky kind of like namespace prefix issues that could have been hard-coded in, say, an Archivist Toolkit database and then got mapped over to ArchiveSpace. And essentially there can be some incompatibilities there. So there's a simple kind of step that tries to clean up those as best it can before anything else happens. The next step, again, this is optional, but it's one we definitely take advantage of, and it's actually crucial to us and crucial for our publication pipeline, and one of the reasons why we're using this service rather than just using OAI PMH is that we need to transform our files once they've been exported from ArchiveSpace. And you can do multiple transformations, but in our case, we're just using a single transformation that essentially cleans up a few of the potential invalidities that could be found in a file, as well as it can also be used to add or enhance the data, and I'll discuss that a little bit more detail. Again, that's an optional step, but it's important for us to do a little bit of cleanup work, something that we can manage locally and outside of ArchiveSpace. And it's also very important for us that is the fourth step for us, because we want to make sure we clean up the file before we actually validate it. And so validation happens at the 5th step. And this 5th step basically just validates the XML file against any schema that it's been associated with. And we're using ArchiveSpace right now to export EAD3 files. So at this step, the exporter app will try to validate the EAD file against the EAD3 schema. If it fails if it fails that validation, however, the whole process stops for that file and we'll move on to the next file on the ads list. If it passes, then it'll go on to the next step. The next step is just a step where people can provide local best practices if they would like using a schematron file. And what schematron does is basically just gives you an ability to write rules about that certain data point, certain things actually need to be in the file. We're actually not using that just yet, but we plan to use it in the next couple of months. We wanted to at least first get over the hurdle of making sure we get all of our files out as valid EAD3. So just as one example, you could put in a test in a schematron file to say that all of your finding aids need to have an abstract. And if they don't have an abstract, you could fail it for validation. The next step would be to generate a PDF. This is optional, but it's actually a step that we're relying on right now in our publication pipeline because this is how we're delivering PDF finding aids through our public interface. But it can be turned off if someone didn't want to use that. And the last step is that all of the files that are exported and are validated and pass that validation step will then be pushed to a Git repository. And that Git repository could be a local private one or it could be a public one. And right now we're using a public GitHub repository, which I'll show here in a little bit. I just want to go into a little bit more detail about 2 of those optional steps, just since I think it might be a little bit just kind of crucial to how we're using it, so I just want to go into a little more detail. The first is how the handles are being created. There's actually 2 things that would trigger a handle to be created. One is you actually have to turn it on in your configuration file. Again, it's actually something that can be done repository specific, but for all of our repositories, we have the step turned on that a handle will be created if one is needed. And the other trigger that needs to happen is the EAD location field needs to be blank and the EAD ID field needs to be filled out, just like you can see at the bottom of the screen here. The reason for that is because we use the EAD ID to create our handle. That becomes a part of our semantic handle. And that the reason we need to have that value blank in the EAD location is because that's how we signal to the exporter app that one needs to be created. And once it's created, again, the exporter app will just write it back to ArchiveSpace without a user having to ever fill that field out manually, which is another boon for us because then it means less typos in the database. So as I mentioned, there was a couple post-export cleanups that we do. Again, this is all bundled into our automated publication pipeline, but I just wanted to mention 2 of those just because if folks do follow our lead in using this exact method, there's a couple of tricky things you might run across. One of the biggest one to me was that we decided to use EAD3 as the export option, and EAD3 is a very new export option in ArchiveSpace. And the biggest issue I found when trying to do this is how dates are exported. I kind of struggled quite a bit for how to reconcile how I really wanted to manage these dates coming out. And at the end of the day, I decided it would be easiest just to modify the EAD3 exporter slightly to produce invalid dates that I could subsequently parse and make them valid dates after the fact. And where this really, I won't go into too much detail, but where it's a little bit complicated with ArchiveSpace and its EAD3 exporter is that EAD3 has this unit date structured element and then this regular unit date element. And so trying to keep those, figuring out which one is connected to which one when the export process happens, and if you have multiple dates associated within your archival component can become a little tricky. So it was easier really just to modify the export. So in case anyone wants to use EAD3 exports, get in touch with me because I would be happy to talk about that because otherwise it's a little bit tricky. And secondly, as mentioned, the XSLT part, it's an optional part of the process, but we use it to do a number of different things. For instance, now that we're actually using EAD3 1.1 because ArchiveSpace is associated with the most recent version of EAD, EAD3 1.1 comes with the option to add a rights declaration element. So we add that in during the XSLT process because you can't actually store that in ArchiveSpace right now. Another one of the things I really like about ArchiveSpace is that it doesn't assume that you're going to have a description that's only tied to one container at a time. So let's say you have subseries level of description, and that's as deep as it goes. You might have 5 boxes attached to it. For human readable kind of display at the end of things, when we get to our PDF, rather than having box 1, box 2, box 3, etc., the XSLT process will just collapse that into a range of box 1 through 5. We also ran into an issue early on with ArchiveSpace that because we have some very large notes, we've noticed that ArchiveSpace only allows you to store notes that are 65,000 characters or shorter. We have at least 10 that are longer than that, so we've split them up, and when things are exported and go through this XSLT process, those are recombined. And last, we just have a bunch of other little changes that happen during the publication pipeline, just to hopefully ensure that all of our files will actually be valid. And again, if they're not, they won't go through the rest of the process. So this is what our GitHub repository looks like. It looks quite a bit different than our, just our flat list of XML files that we used to provide. So it's in some ways it's nice and tidy because each of our repositories gets its own directory, and then we can see how recently each of those directories are being updated. So I think the screenshot, I think I took this, a couple days ago, and you can see here that some of our repositories are updated generally on a nightly basis, and sometimes it's a little bit, 2 days ago, 10 hours ago, etc. And if you dive in and look at one of the EAD finding aids here, you can see here this is one of our E83 finding aids. And not only do you get access to the XML here, but you can also click on the history tab and see all of the different times it's been updated. So the last time that this file was updated was January 22nd of 2019, and before that, December 8th of the previous year. So hopefully just to kind of tie all this together, and while we're doing some of these extra steps in our publication pipeline, this is what that Marcel Louis Bonnier collection looks like in our ArchiveSpace public interface, which we call Archives at Yale. And the reason I chose Bonnier here as an example is because March 18th today was the anniversary of his birthday. So again, just the reason I chose that, because we happen to have that data because we have his name linked to his authority record in LC. But if you look in the upper right-hand corner here, you'll see I've highlighted that PDF finding aid. If you click on that link, that's how you get to our PDF finding aids, and you would see there the last time it was exported was January 22nd, just like you would see if you went to our GitHub site with the EAD file. And last, at the bottom of the page, you see we provide that handle link, which we're calling here our persistent URL. This handle actually wasn't created because this finding aid was around before we were using ArchiveSpace, but for any newly published collections, that exporter app is what's actually creating our handles at the time of the first time the file is exported. So just as a recap, every night we have published resource records that are being exported as EAD and added to that GitHub repository that I showed you. Each of those files is converted into a PDF file during that publication process. If a file had been deleted or unpublished or suppressed, then it'll be removed from that GitHub repository. And if the handle's required, it'll be created and written back to ArchiveSpace so that the archivist doesn't have to do anything. Anytime there's an error that would result in an invalid file, it'll just stop dead in its tracks, and we won't be sending invalid files to ArchiveGrid, et cetera, or anyone else. Because at the end of the day, all of those files are just being pushed to that GitHub repository. So if you're interested in trying this out, the first place I'd say to just go look at is that GitHub repository, because, well, if you're used to using Git, you can actually just clone the repository, but you probably don't really want to keep track of our files. But another really nice thing that GitHub allows you to do is just to download a zip file of all of our 5,000 plus EAD files. And that's actually another kind of added benefit that we never had before with just that flat directory listing. With a flat directory listing, we couldn't easily send someone a zip file, but now we can just by sending them a specific URL that would download all of our files at once. And if you're feeling a little more adventurous or have a need to actually have an export service, you can check out this GitHub repository that Hudson Malongolo hosts. As I mentioned, I was calling this the EAD export service. It's really meant to be more abstract than that, although right now, just out of the box, it does the EAD exports. You could easily modify this if you wanted to get MARC exports, if you wanted to, say, had a need to have EAC exports of your agent records on a nightly basis, or if you just wanted JSON data out or anything else you wanted exported this whole process could be modified to do that. So that's all I had for my part of the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my share and take a drink of water. Sorry, I have a bit of a cold, so I'm sounding a little hoarse here.
Okay, and now we will turn things over to Amanda.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to see about sharing my screen. Can y'all see my Texas Archival Resources online?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, so I am the Assistant Head of Special Collections at the Fonder Library at Rice University, and I'm a longtime participant in Taro, Texas Archival Resources Online, which is our statewide consortium of archival finding aids. As you'll see, the setup for Taro is very different from what Mark just described. We are very much operating on a shoestring of support and old technology, but it still works. So I've been on the steering committee for Taro for almost about 9 years now. The past few years I've also been volunteering as a trainer to go out in the community and work with people who are not familiar with hand encoding EAD using an editor. I also talk to people about using ArchivesSpace to export XML for Taro. And I've helped write some of the grant applications that Taro has put in recently to the National Endowment for the Humanities. So you see on the slide there we have a link to our public site, and then we have a blog that's really for the participating repositories. Our administrative home base is at the University of Texas at Austin, and that's why in our URL it includes UTexas in there. So I'm trying to, okay, here we go. Okay, so this terrible looking slide here is the Taro homepage, and I realize it looks really old, and that's because it is really old. So I thought I would talk for a moment about how Taro got started as a consortium. So we have a really outdated design and a wacky looking short search box, but that's because really the site is essentially 20 years old and hasn't been updated in that time. And so we're working on that. I'm going to cover that in just a moment, but this consortia started with some grant funding in Texas in 1999, and University of Texas Libraries established the Taro website and outsourced encoding of several hundred finding aids, like word-based finding aids from repositories across the state. And then they offered training to the people at those member repositories. And then finally, the repositories started contributing their own hand-coded finding aids in 2002. And so since this time, Taro has really chugged along on almost only this initial infrastructure investment. UT Libraries contributes 5% time of a programmer's time to onboard new Taro members and upload finding aids once a week, and keeping the site running with basic programming updates and maintenance, and performing monthly statistical reporting. So that's the only direct financial support of the site. There are no member fees or other funds coming in at all. So with this in mind, those of us who work with Taro are really proud that the site is still actively used by our researchers and is very much alive. Taro gets about 1 million visits per year, and member institutions are adding about 500 new finding aids every year. The 5% staffer at the University of Texas used to be one person, Minnie Rangel, but now it's split up between 2 staff members who are software developers at UT. We're delighted to have 2 people who know all the bones of Taro. So as you can see, it's really a shoestring operation. And up until recently, we didn't even have a formal governance plan We just had a lot of volunteers, and I think probably a lot of good luck that things have kept going in this manner along the way. Okay, so the way Taro works is that each repository, as you see on the slide, has a login for the development server at UT Libraries. And they can use some kind of secure file transfer tool to upload the XML files. And they have guidance on how to create standard file names and the EAD ID protocol. And then once a week, the UT programmers process the files through Taro. We have one Taro style sheet that produces HTML. So all of the XML files go through that same style sheet and are presented online. And when they're presented online, it's the fully expanded display of the finding aid, including the full container list, kind of like if you were exporting from ArchivesSpace to a PDF. It kind of looks something like that. So from the perspective of a trainer, we've had significant training challenges with keeping all the member repositories up to date on training for hand encoding. Most of these repositories that participate in Taro don't have ArchivesSpace. A handful of them do, the bigger institutions. But we have about 50 member repositories across the state, and they're all shapes and sizes. And so just over time with staff turnover and such, that people lose their familiarity with how to encode EAD in an XML editor. So we have training once or twice a year in person. It's like a 15-person training. There's 2 trainers and then up to 15 students per workshop. It's an all-day workshop that has theory in the beginning of why we're doing this the way we're doing it, and then a hands-on portion in the afternoon. And by the end of that workshop, everybody in the class is able to use the XML editor to create a file and send it in to Taro. We do have an Excel to mail merge hack for XML, but it still requires editing in the XML editor. So let's see, we don't have a compliance checker for Taro, and so that has resulted in 20 years of index term messiness and other kinds of messiness. You can only imagine if you start to think about that. We have like very baseline requirements for what you need to do in order to send things in to Taro. It needs to be valid XML and follow the basic file naming and EAD ID protocol, and that's about it. So in the future, we would love to have a compliance checker that requires more rigorous review of the XML that goes in. Also in the future, we would love to have a GitHub submission environment like what Mark was showing in his setup. So we have all these dreams and wishes for improving Taro. And so our steering committee put together an NEH planning grant, which we were awarded in 2015, and we worked on it in 2016. And really this was kind of pushed along because we were really starting, originally the Taro website only accepted DTD compliant XML. And as there became more systems available to people, such as Archivist Toolkit and Archon, people were exporting schema-compliant EAD from their systems, and that was not working in Taro. So we really had to get a steering committee in gear and work on making the site schema-compliant, which we did, and we wrote an NEH planning grant to be ready to then follow up with an implementation grant. We did send in the implementation grant in the fall, and so we're looking forward this month in March to finding out if we are going to receive that funding to do a lot of updates. And if you're interested in what we want to do and how we plan to do it and what our governance plan looks like, and our memorandum of understanding with UT Libraries as our administrative home base. All that kind of stuff is available on our wiki, and the bit.ly address is right here in the presentation for that if you want to go in and see all of that. And part of what we looked at when we were doing this planning grant exploration was what would be the best platform going forward for Taro. And so, of course, ArchiveSpace was considered and tested. Other systems that we tested were the XTF system that the California Digital Library developed and a number of other sites use in lots of beautiful ways. And then also the access to memory, A to M. So we tested these sites, and we really had high hopes that it would be possible for us to use one of these systems. So as it turned out, we wound up realizing that we just didn't have the financial bandwidth or the programming support that we were going to need to do anything much more complicated than what we were already doing. None of the members of Taro have ever paid for their participation in Taro, and we just didn't see that being possible. So we were exploring, like, what would it look like for ArchiveSpace users to participate in Taro using their ArchiveSpace setup. So on our blog, and there's the address there, there's guidance for setting up your ArchiveSpace instance to be Taro friendly. It's really easy. You just do a couple of repository settings, such as the MARC organization code and your country code. And within your individual resource records, you set the EAD ID as your Taro number, which follows a pattern there. The pattern that you see on the slide is for Taro repository Lamar University. It says Lamar, and then it has a 5-digit conclusion to the EAD ID. That 5-digit piece also serves as the file name. So the file name for this example would be 00012.xml, and it would just go directly into Lamar's directory. They only have access to their own directory, and they just log in with their repository credentials and drag and drop that XML file in there. The other thing that we do in ArchiveSpace to create Taro-friendly files is to use the numbered C tags. There have been a few issues with exporting EAD from ArchiveSpace and having them work in the Taro environment. We had some hiccups with exporting the XML code, how the XML code in the EAD works for digital objects that don't have a file URI. So we have some digital objects that are dark, so they have an identifier, but they don't have a file version or file URI. And the code that was being exported was trying to represent that as a link, a live link, but it was dead. And so that was something that we needed to kind of tweak on our end here at Rice. We worked on that. We also have a couple of hiccups with the X-link encoding. And I also wanted to mention that we're not using EAD3 yet with Taro, although ArchiveSpace supports it. So we were thinking about whether ArchiveSpace might work as a consortium for our statewide needs, especially since it would be a real benefit to our members who have XML editing challenges. So we thought about what if we could talk to Lyrasis for a hosted solution to have one instance that hosts all of our repositories. We came up against the problem of money there. And so that kind of stopped us in our tracks on doing a hosted solution at Lyrasis, just because there's not money out there coming from Taro repositories. Just not going to happen. And then we thought about what if there could be a model where there was one repository operating a consortial ArchiveSpace instance that has lots of multiple repositories. So maybe that one repository that has a lot of resources could be an ArchiveSpace member of, you know, the very large size probably, and pay all of those costs themselves, or maybe they would take a sliding scale fee from the participating repositories. You can imagine that that's kind of financially messy. I'm not sure that would even have been a possibility in terms of ArchiveSpace policy. So that was not, we didn't think that that was going to be workable in the end either, and we also didn't have any repositories volunteering to serve in that role, and certainly not UT Libraries, who has graciously hosted us all these years. They really just didn't have more staff time to offer us beyond what we already have from them. So our choice to sort of stay in the same system that we've had, more or less, was cost-driven mainly, and it also had some you know, challenges in terms of who would manage such an instance. So that's how we have wound up basically. Still, we're going to use a simple system of uploading XML no matter how our repositories create the XML. And that is the basics on Taro. And so I have here on the slide a reminder of the public site address, info for repositories who participate. That's a really good site. It has information about how to join Taro. So if other states were looking to perhaps start their own shoestring state repository, they could look at some of these documents. And then we have that wiki where I was showing you that the NEH grant files are there, and among steering committee minutes and lots of other things. If other people wanted to see how the sausage is made, you're welcome to go and do that. And I think that's about it. So
Great.
Stop the share.
Thank you to both Mark and Amanda, and now start taking questions, and I will read what's in the chat, comes up in the chat, and try to direct them to one of our presenters. Okay, so from Christine DeBella, Amanda is asking, or she's asking a question for Amanda. Do most institutions in Taro provide access to their collections separate from Taro as well?
Some of them do, but many of them don't. So in our case, we're ArchiveSpace members here at Rice, and we, you know, have our public side turned on for ArchiveSpace. We share our finding aids, both on our local library website and on Taro. So some other places do that, but a lot of people, both big and small, just use Taro as their site where their finding aids are. And I meant to also mention that ArchiveGrid crawls Taro for a lot of these repositories.
Okay, from Stephen Innes, he's outside the US, but is wondering if OAC or similar consortium is an option for sharing your EAD. And I don't know if that's to Amanda or to Mark.
I will say that the Online Archive of California is it's a fantastic site, but I mean it is focused on California, and there are different consortiums around the nation. Archives West is one for the Pacific Northwest area. You know, Arizona has its own statewide consortium, and so, but for us in Texas, we don't have another option. There's not a regional consortium that would cover us geographically.
Okay. From Bill G, he wants to know if, I assume again for Taro, if you need to know which repository the material is in, or if it's a totally global search.
Okay, you don't need to know which repository the material is in. So you can do a search and it will search across all the finding aids from all the repositories and give you a hit list. And it will highlight your search term in context when you see the hit list. So that's kind of handy. You can also browse the repositories. You can see which repositories participate and click on one that's of interest to you. Maybe it's in your town and you have a need to stay local for whatever reason. You can click on that and just page through all of their finding aids there.
Great. Mark posted the link to the Online Archive of California, so thanks for that. And then Christine DeBella has a question for everyone, including our audience. She's curious how many people here are in institutions that participate in one of these regional consortia or aggregators for finding aids. She says, feel free to answer in the chat. Krista Oldham says she used to. And there's the virginiaheritage.org or vaheritage.org site for Virginia. And
Hi, Rebecca.
the Texas State Archives is a member of Taro. And Megan Firestone is in Texas, but her institution doesn't participate in Taro.
Mm-hmm. We have a number of repositories in the state that don't participate in Taro, and we would love for them to participate, and if they were interested in doing that. And currently we have 5 years of funding from a foundation here in Texas to provide some money for outsourced encoding of finding aids. So we work with the repositories to show them how to format their Word finding aids, to send in to a team of volunteers from Taro who review it, and then they send it on to the vendor who marks it up in XML. It comes back as XML, and those volunteers review the XML, and then with the repository's consent and review, they upload it for them in Taro. So that's nice. We're hoping to get as many as 1,000 new finding aids up that way for new repositories.
Let's see, a couple of other people have posted some of their regional aggregators, and Mark's also posted a couple of international portals for archival finding aids. And then Stephen, I think that's Majewski's, mentioned his using or testing using OAI for harvesting other Virginia ArchivesSpace users. And they are also have something for small public library users who would like something like ArchiveSpace for authoring finding aids. And, oh, people are posting more links. So explorechicagocollections.org, the communityarchive.org in New Zealand. Used to be one, or there is one in Arkansas, but Danielle Butler's is not participating currently. There are states participate, or the states brainstorming how to do it, hoping to follow the Chicago Collections model.
Yeah, the Chicago Collections model is amazing. It's so beautiful and elegant. That would have been our dream solution for Taro. Would have been really fantastic. It just was, well, I think we could have gotten money to implement it, but then having money to support it over time was the sticking point for us. We just weren't going to be able to have a minimum of 2 staff members dedicated to it. That just was not going to happen. We're at the 5% of 1 person level.
A couple of more examples. So Rocky Mountain Online Archives, which is described as very similar to Taro. And then the National Library of Australia has also started harvesting finding aids from other institutions in their area. Oh, and Christine DeBella's asked Ben Joseph if he knows what kind of software or structure underpins the Chicago site, or if anyone happens to know.
Somebody else may know better than I do, but yeah, I'm agreeing with Ben that it's XTF underneath with some, lovely customization.
Okay, there is a GitHub, and they did a presentation at a Lyricist Leadership Forum in Kansas City. I assume someone at Lyricist can find out if that was recorded. And then Christine DeBella is also now asking if anyone's looked into ArcLight. Oh, and also Bill G's looking into how to set up a separate repository for each chapter and then feed into a national global one.
So I'm not sure what you mean by a separate repository, Bill G, but that's essentially, I think, if I'm reading it correctly, what we're doing by just having each of our repositories in ArchivesSpace, be able to control those EAD exports that are right now, being picked up by OCLC's ArchiveGrid. And I didn't know that the Chicago one was XTF, but there's a lot of really good XTF sites out there. It doesn't seem like they are continuing to update that software anymore, unfortunately.
Let's see. Christine DeBella has asked, or has posted a link to Tri Colleges in Pennsylvania, which uses one ArchiveSpace for 3 different institutions. And then Danielle Butler's asking for any relevant links for ArcLight.
The only folks I know is currently using it at the University of Albany, but I can share that link. I think, and if Steve's still on the group, I think he's used that as well as Virginia, ArcLight. Let's see.
And Krista Oldham's just posted a link to a ArcLight demo page.
I'm having trouble finding the link, but it should be one second. So I put the link in the chat for Albany's. I think that search is more than just ArcLight, but if you just search the collections there, those would be, and then select one of those would actually be their instance of ArcLight, which is, I think, live as of January or February.
And Stephen from Virginia has mentioned that they've tested ArcLight, but has running into problems from the way it uses EAD ID to link elements together. Madeline Sheldon just posted the title to the Chicago Collections Lyricist Leadership Forum presentation, which she doesn't know whether or not that was recorded. Okay, I don't see any more questions coming in at the chat. So I will turn things over to the lightning round now. Thank you all for listening.